So our topic today is on the kind of current and future issues happening in the PA profession. We spent a lot of time on PA history, and so now we're going to talk about some of the hot topics going on in our profession. And this, interestingly, is probably one of the oldest hot topics that keeps becoming hot over and over and over again. And that is, what should we be called? Some of the names up here that I have are things that we've been referred to over the time. Some of them have been different titles granted by different programs or titles that have been used in different languages. And I had to put this on here for Professor Jar. If you ever want to see Professor Jar's blood pressure go to 200 over 120 in an instant, write in a paper or show her something that says physician's '(S) assistant, and her face will immediately turn beet red. So I always like to include that for her. But that, even some of the early articles that by some of the PA journals use that language as physician's assistant. Mid-level provider is kind of something that has really fallen out of favor lately. Usually advanced practice provider is kind of the more commonly used term to refer to both PAs and NPs. Physician extender was kind of early on something that they talked about. And then I also included some of the other things that you have to think about if you want to change your title. It has to get changed in all the state laws, it has to get changed in all the federal laws, it has to get changed in the language of privileging at different health systems. So it's not an easy thing to just change. So here's one of the more recent articles that were written. There was a survey done in May of 2019 of both currently practicing PAs and students. And a lot of people agreed to the statement that they didn't feel like physician assistant really reflected their role, that the title was not a good fit. And they also had a lot of listening sessions. These were mostly conducted by American Academy of Physician Assistants and some of their state chapters. And they just keep hearing that people think the title is not a good fit. It doesn't really reflect what we do. It gives the impression to patients that we are not able to practice at all independently. And so this is, like I said, this is the most recent round of this. It's been an ongoing discussion for at least as long as I've been a PA. So this most recent round, AAPA decided to do some research. They went through several phases. So those early listening sessions were kind of part of phase 1 and phase 2. And then they went on to looking at all the places where PAs are named as physician assistants and what would have to go into changing all of that legislation if we were to have a title change. Phase 4 then was looking at possible alternative titles, and I've got another slide of that in a minute. Looking for conflicts, seeing what people thought about potentially different titles. Phase 5, they did some more research on possible titles and looked at some legal conflicts. And then phase 6 has been delayed. So that was supposed to be looking at the financial implications and then presenting a full report in May of this year. That has now been rescheduled to the November meeting, November 2020. And they've said all along they don't know what the conclusion of this is going to be. It doesn't necessarily mean at the conclusion of all of this research they're going to pursue or recommend a title change. This was just kind of information gathering. So the survey that they sent out last year to students and faculty and practicing PAs, these were the 4 titles that they had on there. How do y'all feel about praxitian? What does that bring to mind for you? Anybody have some thoughts on that?
I just think that patients would be like, what is that? Nobody even knows what that is.
I don't know why, but it reminds me of the Lorax, so I'm not the biggest fan.
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like a medication.
Mm-hmm. Medical practitioner. That one brought up a lot of, so MP is also military police and also sounds very similar to NP, nurse practitioner. So there was a lot of concern about confusion with that particular option. Clinicist. Any thoughts on that one?
It's very vague.
Yeah. The thing that came to mind for me when I saw that in the survey was like, don't they call some people that work at like the cosmetic counter and apply makeup, like aren't those clinicists or some of them? So yeah, I thought that was also very, was going to take as much explaining to patients as explaining my current title. So there was a lot of discussion on some of our discussion boards that like some people even suspected like the whole point of this was to point everyone towards physician associate. Like they were making the other options so problematic that would force everyone to agree on one title. So that was some of the discussion going on at the time last year. And I've not seen, because that report hasn't been released yet, I haven't seen any results of
What are the negatives of that you hear about physician associate? I personally have always liked that one, and you can keep the PA title, but what are other people saying as a negative to that one?
I think the main argument against that particular one has been that like an associate sounds like someone who doesn't necessarily practice in the same way, you know, like it's associated with, but not in the same realm as. So I think that's probably been the main negative I've seen that one. The thing that most people tend to like about this one is it would still keep us as PAs, which kind of simplifies teaching to patients and other things. And some programs have in the past, and some currently do, grant a physician associate degree. So that one probably has been one of the most frequently discussed alternative titles, and probably has a lot of general agreement on that. Anyone else have discussion or comments on this?
Do you think that a name change is actually likely to happen based on the way this is going, or is that just something that is kind of being talked about?
I guess I don't feel like I'm hearing enough of the inside discussion at APAPA to really judge. I mean, like I said, this discussion has been going on for at least my entire career. It would come up in journals every year or two. It comes up on the discussion boards all the time. There is a subset of PAs that say, hey, I've been a physician assistant for 30 years and that's my title and I don't want to change it. So there is a group of people that are against changing the title at all. I think more people are in favor of it, especially now as PAs are gaining more and more independent practice rights. And just the whole vision from patients and sometimes other professionals that an assistant means that you don't have the knowledge and skills to practice anything independently, which doesn't really reflect what most of us do. So more to come on this. If they go ahead and present their findings at the November 2020 meeting, then that should get made public and we will hear kind of what the recommendations are. Hopefully they will be transparent with the findings of that survey. That survey included not just possible titles, it was kind of a lot of, do you really feel like physician assistant reflects what you do? Do you feel like people understand what you do? So there was kind of some foundation laying information in there about should the title change at all. So this will be interesting. This is, I feel like unless the thing that comes out of the meeting in November is that either yes, they're going to look into going forward with it, or no, they somehow have conclusively proved that the legal aspects and financial aspects of title change are insurmountable, that this is not going to go away. And then PAs in primary care versus specialty care. And Dr. Locken gave me some of her slides that she did at a another presentation for, I believe it was for AAPA. So I was grateful that she let me use some of her research on this. So kind of when we're talking about the history of the profession, a lot of that early work was to look for ways to extend PAs into primary care, and that there was a huge shortage of primary care providers. That continues to persist. We know that as baby boomers age and that as more and more people have access to healthcare, the demand for family practice, internal medicine, kind of all those primary care providers has just continued to grow over the years. However, the number of medical students choosing family medicine as their specialty has really gone through a big drop and has remained pretty stagnant. There's a projected general physicians shortage. In the next 10 years, there's projected to be a shortage between 40,000 and 100,000 physicians, depending on where you are geographically and which trends you're following. Population in general is projected to continue to grow, and particularly that segment of the population that's 65 and older who need much more medical care, that segment is projected to grow 55% in that same time period. So this huge gap of we need more primary care providers, we need more providers in general, at the same time that we're going to find more and more people are going to be needing more and more care as they age. It's kind of brewing this perfect storm. This is data from Minnesota in particular. So this was taken from the last survey they did in 2019 in June of actively licensed physicians in Minnesota. And you can see that the group that's kind of in that 45 and older population is, what's 37, 43, almost just not quite half of the physician population are 45 and older. There's also a trend that physicians seem to be somewhat retiring younger than they used to. There used to be more and more physicians that would stay in practice well past 65 years old, and that trend seems to be trending down. Thank goodness, I'd say. Like, people deserve to retire after a good career. And then if you look geographically in the state of Minnesota, so median age of physician by region. So we've got a good chunk of the state that the median age is 50 right now. And again, this is on 2019 data. So if a good portion of those are planning on retiring by 65, that's a huge chunk that's going to be retiring in the next 10 to 15 years. And then physician assistants in Minnesota. So this data is a little bit older. I have a slide that has some newer data from that same time period, but not broke down quite the same way. So this is broke down both by age and by geographic region. And you can see, especially in the small rural areas and more isolated rural areas in Minnesota, there's a huge chunk of PAs also moving into retirement age. That purple group is 55 and older, and the green being 45 to 55. So more younger PAs in the large rural and urban areas. And then this is some of the newer data that just shows, without the geographic breakdown, that again, we still have 28, so a quarter of our PAs in the 45 and older group. I was at a PA conference probably 5 years ago, and they asked, they're like, if everyone's comfortable like revealing your age, they asked us to stand up, and when they called your age group, and so they had everyone stand up if they're 65 or older, and then they had them standing, and then if you were 55 and older. And before I think they got to 50 and older, like 3/4 of the room was standing. So kind of the more, at least, active MAPA members, people who are tend to be kind of more active in legislation, leaders from different health systems, there was a whole chunk of them there that were in the older age group, which just creates concern of, again, we're supposed to be helping with the shortfall, but if there's a huge chunk of PAs in Minnesota that are also reaching retirement age, and not as many younger people filling in behind, then this cliff is still looming. And then, like we said, we combine that with the number of people that have numerous chronic conditions that need more healthcare in all areas of specialty is just increasing. So we've had, people are trying to get creative and like, how do we fill this gap both in primary care and just the general gap of care if PAs and NPs and physicians, as we are currently training and graduating them and traditionally using them, don't look like it's going to be enough. So PAs and NPs are part of the solution. If we're able to work more broadly, more independently, as changes are being made to scope of practice laws to let people kind of work to the fullest extent of their title. But this also kind of globally in healthcare means that we also need to be able to use RNs and PTs and OTs to the fullest extent of their capabilities, and that we may need to have other members of the healthcare team, pharmacy, for example. Pharmacy is taking on more and more kind of roles that were traditionally only done by primary care practice, like vaccination, like education on some conditions. So certainly PAs are a part of the solution, but at least the current data show that like there's still going to be a shortage. And so this just shows where kind of office-based primary care, where they have PAs, and you can see like in Minnesota, PAs or NPs are pretty well penetrated into primary care, whereas there are some states that really have some catching up to do to add PAs and NPs to primary care to really deliver care to those areas. And a lot of these are general shortage areas already. So traditionally, about a third of practicing PAs are working in primary care. That somewhat varies when you look at stuff depending on kind of how they count that. So do they count just family practice as primary care? Do they include pediatrics? Do they include internal medicine? Different studies count it different ways. And then they looked more recently at, so who tended to be going into primary care? And they found it was more often female providers, Hispanic origin, older PAs, and those who have lower socioeconomic status. And they feel like some of this might also reflect the demographics of those areas. So this might somewhat reflect people going back to their home communities. And again, here in Minnesota, more recent numbers. So family practice, 27.8%. And then if you counted peds and internal medicine in there, we're right about that same mark. Be interesting to see if this changes after this year. So PAs have been in the top 10 and sometimes top 1 or 2 careers in different rankings. I wonder if post-COVID, when suddenly PAs were getting laid off, that has never been an issue in recent memory, if that's going to change this outlook at all. And how the kind of forced adoption of telemedicine in a lot of areas where it hadn't been used, if that's going to make a change. And then this slide is just kind of looking again at how often are PAs likely to change their career? So if they started in primary care, are they going to stay? If they started in a specialty, how likely might they move to primary care? And also, this also was looking at how it was affected by if you were going to need any kind of additional certification to change specialties, or if some of these residency programs or additional formal training were just going to be required. Like, how would that affect your likeliness to change? So overall, they find that typically about 75% of PAs do change specialties over the course of the year. The average is about 1.95 specialties per decade of the career, and I guess I fit pretty close to that. So PAs are even more likely to change than they previously thought, but the more additional training and certifications that you add on to be successful in switching, the less likely people are to change. And this trend over time, so in the early years of PA, back from PA history, primary care and specialty, all other specialty cares were fairly equally chosen. About half of PAs were in primary care, and now that's declined to about a third. And there's a lot of things that go into that. Probably one of the big drivers is as PA education has gotten more expensive and salaries and reimbursement over the past couple of decades have been higher in specialty areas, like more PAs are going to choose to go into specialty care to, you know, get those student loans paid off and have a better career. So that's one of the things that hopefully is driving better reimbursement in primary care. This is kind of the most recent breakdown from AAPA as far as where PAs tend to end up working. This one's by work setting, hospital versus urgent care versus outpatient care, and then primary care versus specialty care. So there's been this trend over time towards more inpatient care and more specialty care and away from primary care. And then a few years ago, and we'll come back to this in a few weeks when we talk more about continuing education and certification. And this did come up in our timeline of the Certificate of Added Qualification, which is something that you can test for through AAPA or NCCPA, and you have to have specialty CME in an area that you're going to test in. You have to have 1 to 2 years of practice in that specialty. You have to have a physician write a letter of support that you've worked and you are competent in that area of specialty. You have to pass the exam. Oh yeah, and of course you have to pay them to take the exam, and then you can get this credential. And so some of the controversy over this added qualification is if this became kind of an expectation that PAs working in specialties where this is available got this, then it might start limiting either people being able to move into certain specialties if they're looking for people that already have it, because how do you ever get it if you can't get hired and get 1 to 2 years experience? And is it going to start becoming a barrier to PAs moving? But on the other side, some were saying that by getting a certificate of added qualification, then it was easier for them to get hired in a wider variety of settings.
Does that certificate replace the provider agreement that PAs have needed in the past?
No. So it was just basically saying I am board certified and I have this additional certification in this area of specialty. And there's only, I think, about 10. There's cardiovascular surgery, ER, hospital medicine, orthopedics, pediatrics, psych, nephrology. I think I'm missing a couple. So there's not even certificates of added qualifications for all specialties.
Do they have to recertify with that like every 2 years as well?
You do have to recertify with it. I don't remember off the top of my head the frequency of it, but we'll get to that when we cover certification. So this is kind of another controversial area right now among PAs, is some really support this and feel like it's been very helpful to their career, and others feel like it's not needed and that it is going to start to create this expectation that I'm not going to hire a PA in the ER unless they have the ER certificate of added qualification. And then what degree do we earn is another really hot topic right now in our profession. They actually just last week had I believe they called it a listening session or a town hall meeting in PAEA among the education specialties to discuss the pros and cons of offering a doctoral level degree. So we've had, for lack of a better term, degree creep in the PA profession, as many other occupations have. So initially, some programs were just a certificate. There was associate degree PA programs, and then initially most programs were bachelor's degrees. Now the standard is master's. But as the nurse practitioners have moved to a doctorate degree, that has even sparked more debate whether more PA programs should be offering a doctoral degree. And then the debate is, if we are moving to that, where should it be? So should it be the standard degree? Everyone gets a doctoral degree? Should it be, as most programs are now, like an add-on option? After you complete your regular degree, you can go back and get a doctoral degree, maybe either geared to education to be faculty, or as a kind of leading up to a specialty area, or part of a postgraduate like residency program, like we talked about some of those are. So there's lots of discussion about this right now. There has been some strong voices of this is necessary to put us on a level playing field with nurse practitioners. There are also strong voices saying, how is that going to impact our profession if we make the doctoral degree kind of the base degree for all PA education, because that impacts the need for more prerequisite education, more competition potentially for spots, can definitely impact diversity of candidates. The higher we raise that threshold for entry level, the more we are going to screen out people that might have otherwise been good candidates. Increasing cost is certainly a concern. And then does that make the pipeline even longer? So if we're going to be a doctoral degree, do we need to be a 3-year program as opposed to a 2-year or a 27-month or a 28-month? And if it's going to be a longer program and a doctoral degree, like, doesn't that blur the line between med school and PA school even further? Like, how many people are going to feel that there's as much of an advantage if they're going to a 3-year program. So there's a lot of controversy going on right now. Do you guys have thoughts about that, or?
So, question real quick here. So, if the nurses, so assuming the nurse becomes a doctor or has a doctorate, would she still be referred to as a nurse practitioner or something else? And the second thing is, as a PA, just like you said, the money for, so the attraction to PA school is on the assumptions of rural health, for example, is what sold me to do PA. So because I'm going back to health, so that's the whole point. And so by adding this degree, just like pharmacy did some years back, it was a bachelor's degree, and then it became a doctor of pharmacy, and the pay rise didn't go up that much. So you finish school with the doctorate, you extend the number of years of school, you graduate, and you end up with so much amount, so like a large amount of student debt. But the pay doesn't actually correspond to that increase in education. And then so so it's interesting that but the first question I have is, would the nurses, so a nurse practitioner, would they change the name from a nurse practitioner, or it will still be nurse practitioner?
So the nurse practitioner programs, their title is still nurse practitioner. They can use doctor in their title because they have a doctorate degree. Most programs are offering that now. But that's true also of doctor of physical therapy, and so it's a creep across, like you said, pharmacy. It's happening across a lot of healthcare professions.
So like, do you know what makes the nurse practitioner program like a doctorate? Because it used to be a master's, and like relatively recently it's a doctorate now, right?
Right. No, I don't know. I think some programs added more research component to it. And some of the programs are a little bit longer now, but most programs, and I am not an expert in this area, so I don't think the content of some of the programs change significantly. And that's the other part of this debate, is if we're going to make PA a doctorate degree, like if you added up the number of hours, true hours, that most PA programs have, like credit load wise, it's equivalent to a lot of doctoral degrees already. So is it just a change in the degree offered, or is it a change in content? Does something more need to be added? So if you get a doctoral degree, does that mean you have more research knowledge or more healthcare administrative knowledge or more education background? So, this is all part of the discussion going on.
I feel like creating the PA program into a doctorate program, you're right, probably just spreads out our curriculum over 3 years as opposed to the 2 years that it's at. But then it just further limits the amount of providers or amount of people who are going to be like readily available to help the areas that are in need of it. Like you said, a lot of people are kind of getting older in the profession. And I think that's just one more barrier of entry to providing good care to the people. So I feel like that'd be fairly out of touch from what is needed in medicine currently.
Yeah, that's one concern. And like we said, the other concern is when you're trying to recruit more people into particularly primary care, and you look at who those people typically are, and we talked about ethnic minorities, older, female, are those people less likely to even get into the pipeline if it's a longer pipeline, a more expensive pipeline? Are we going to be losing some of the pool of applicants that are the ones that are needed the most? So,
I was going to say a couple of things.
yeah.
About the nurse practitioner programs, my understanding is all the people I've known doing it, there's so many of them are online and not as intense. So many of them are actually working throughout their time in their education. So that would be a real important differentiation to make. And to touch on what Mike said too about nurse practitioners or PAs getting their doctorates, I thought it was my understanding that you still can't call yourself a doctor in practice. In the clinical setting, it's only outside of that. Is that true?
I don't think that's a rule, I don't think there's, at least at the health systems that I'm aware of, there's nothing that if you've earned a PhD or a doctorate of some level, like there's nothing to prevent you from using that credential. Most code of ethics, and ours is one that says that, is that you have to make sure that you are accurately representing yourself as a PA. So even if I had a doctorate, and if I decided to use Dr. Garvey as my title, that I had better make it very clear to my patients that my training is as a physician assistant, and I can't be taken as misconstruing my training to my patients. So even if I chose to be Dr. Garvey, I have to make it clear that it's not an MD or DO degree.
Within the field is, and in the context of this degree creep, is it a given that as things and if things change that people already certified will be sort of grandfathered in? Or is there the possibility that then further certification will be required down the road if they decided to change things to a doctorate, for example?
Yeah, so based on what has happened in the past, if you had a bachelor's degree as a PA, when programs all switched over to master's degree, like you didn't have to go back and get your master's degree to continue practicing as a PA clinically. What it has affected is, for example, we can't hire a bachelor trained PA to be a faculty person to teach at a master's degree level. So it can affect some things that way, but they were grandfathered in as far as like continuing to practice clinically. And then there did come some programs up of taking people who are trained with a bachelor's degree and just allowing them to do some additional like online training and earn their master's degree. Almost like a some of the nursing programs where they can change their degree with some additional training. So that may be an option as well.
Did it affect insurance reimbursement when it switched from bachelor's to master's?
Not that anything that I'm aware of. Yeah, and that's kind of another part of this whole discussion of master's versus doctorate is, and as Mike kind of alluded to, like, so what are we as PAs going to get out of having a doctoral degree if salaries aren't going to be affected and it doesn't open a lot of new doors other than the ones that have the kind of the postgraduate residency open doors similarly, like having the certificate of added qualification degrees might, or people looking to go into education and research. Definitely having those doctoral degrees might make a difference, but yeah, what is the benefit to the individual of having that additional degree?
I've read about these. I know there's some programs out there already that do the doctorates. And I know that they said it's just to get you on a level playing field, give you that title to represent what you're doing. But do they ever say if it'll add the benefit of, not having to recertify every 2 years for a lot of these PAs or anything?
No, there's no discussion right now that it would change certification requirements for anyone. So right now, I feel like the main benefits are kind of what we said, like those programs that offer a doctorate that are kind of more geared to a particular subspecialty or specialty area, and then for those in education. So some universities or colleges, you have to have a doctoral degree to be considered for advancement within the department or things like that. All right. So the last time AAPA and PAA took this up was in 2009, and at that end of that time, they reaffirmed that they felt like the master's degree was the appropriate entry-level and terminal degree for the profession, and at that time they were opposed to a PA-specific doctoral degree. And in 2007, about 55% of practicing PAs thought like the entry-level doctor of PA degree was unnecessary. By 2010, when they interviewed students, 49% favored it if the additional time was less than 12 months and the cost was less than a 30% increase. So that was the last big student data. And like I said, they just did this big listening session on this again at PAEA, so I'll be watching for any data that comes out of that. I see that more and more programs right now are looking at offering some sort of doctoral degree, and probably one thing fueling that, in addition to the whole level playing field and other things that we've talked about, is right now there is not basically an ARC-PA equivalent of accrediting doctoral programs. So some of what might be fueling this is if programs feel like this is the direction things are going, then they want to get ahead of ARC-PA. If ARC-PA is going to get into this and start coming up with accreditation requirements for doctoral programs, they would like to be ahead of that curve.
Professor Garvey, did you say, is the most recent study that you said you're going to look for coming out, was that a survey of PA students or practicing PAs?
So the one that just happened was actually mostly PA faculty. It was a PAEA listening, like town hall.
Do you think like faculty have bias? I think it's just kind of interesting that like some of these are questioning practicing PAs versus PA students, because I feel like people that are practicing might feel very different than, you know, students who aren't out there yet. They maybe don't know the advantages or disadvantages of having the non-doctorate degree, and I feel like faculty might have a bias. But
I think that could be true. I think faculty probably right now are feeling more pressure towards getting a doctoral degree themselves. If that affects their ability to get promoted within their departments or to be considered for tenure, you know, I think faculty probably have some unique perspectives on that. I haven't heard of any new surveys being done of either students or practicing PAs, but I would imagine that if some recommendations came out of PAEA to look more at their changing their position, then I would expect AAPA to take that up as well among practicing providers.
Do you see one of the driving forces behind this at all being revenue for universities? Because I always see that coming up in these discussions, that with degree creep, whether it's, you know, we're talking PA, nurse practitioner, physical therapy, whatever. Do you think there's some truth to that or not? I don't really know, but it's a way to just keep people in school longer, more money for the universities. I don't know. What's your thought?
I always suspect that, especially in the current age, that colleges and universities are always trying to think of creative ways to increase their revenue. I guess I haven't heard that being discussed as one of the primary drivers. I feel like the discussion has more been, especially as nurse practitioner has moved more universally towards a doctoral degree, that some PAs themselves even think like, is that gonna, if a hospital is trying to decide between hiring a nurse practitioner and a PA, is that gonna tip the scales? But yeah, I'm sure there's some element of that in there.
I have a question about certification and maintaining that. If you're a faculty member like yourself, do you also have to practice for a certain amount of hours to recertify or anything to that effect? Or can teaching faculty just teach and stay certified for years on end?
There is not a particular requirement, at least from taking the board standpoint, about how many hours clinically you're working.
Sure.
A lot of programs have some element in their teaching contracts that you're expected to have a certain amount of clinical practice. Some schools don't have that in there at all, so.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. And then the other trend in PA is the PA model being spread and adopted in other countries and spreading internationally. Probably one of the biggest areas that this is spreading right now is in the UK. They are at least getting the structure in place very similar to the structure here as far as developing programs, developing an accreditation model, looking at different models of training. And it is pretty common now when we attend like PAEA conferences that there are people from other countries there learning about our model of how we educate and train PAs and taking that back to other countries. So some of the dilemmas have been like different levels of training, different times of timing. Is it something that they do right out of high school? Is it something that you do out of college? How long is the program? How are they being used? Are they being used in primary care, outpatient, inpatient? Title discussion comes up in other countries as well. What's appropriate for their country? PAs trained in the US that also are doing more and more work internationally, whether that be mission work or other types of work. And so this is, again, a really big area of growth, and then trying to see if there can be any kind of international standards developed so that if a PAA is certified in one country, does that mean that they can work in other countries in the same way? So if this is especially a particular interest for you in global health, there are two organizations, PAs for Global Health and the Fellowship of Christian PAs, that are really doing a lot of work in this area right now. And you can find their information through AAPA. And then, of course, one of the more recent things in our profession is the optimal team practice push. So moving towards team-based practice and trying to move away from some of the legal requirements and regulations to work directly under a particular supervising or collaborating physician and make it more of a practice-based issue so that you work within a team and not like under a particular person. advocating for kind of more autonomous state boards and PAs kind of monitoring PAs. And then also working towards being reimbursed directly rather than being reimbursed under a supervising physician's license. So this just passed in Minnesota, and it's, I haven't seen the latest data on how many states have passed this now, but this is definitely kind of where AAPA and state chapters are trying to move PAs. And we'll talk, when we talk more about like what supervision used to look like and how that is changing, and the pros and cons of that, we'll get into that even more. And you will hear about this, I'm sure, at MAPA too. More current events. So if this is something that you're interested in, there are some websites. The PAs for Tomorrow and AAPA Huddle are two places where you can kind of listen in on discussions and read what's going on. I put my little meme up there about I love office politics, just as a, just to be aware that there tends to be certain recurrent loud voices, just like in any area, I think, of when you're getting into kind of politics. Some things can sound on the Huddle or on PAs for Tomorrow. You might get the impression that that is a general consensus based on some loud voices there, and may not actually tend to represent wider views. But it is a good place to kind of see what's being discussed and follow kind of these current event discussions. I think that's it. Oh, no, recertification. So recertification, how we do repeat boards. This has been hotly debated. So 2 years ago now, AAPA was going to try to find their own board certification. They were going to have an alternative to NCCPA. There was going to be a whole different board process. It got to the point where I remember Professor Jar and I having a discussion that we felt like all of our 4-pillar parents were preparing for divorce. It got pretty nasty for a while between especially AAPA and NCCPA. There was a lot of really strong language being used, and like APA had really gotten to the point of like, we're gonna hire a research team, we're gonna start our own board process. There's gonna be a new board and PAs can choose whether they can take NCCPA's board or some other board. And right when it got to the brink of divorce, they had a peace treaty essentially, and the offering was the currently ongoing alternative PANRE, which is what Professor Labor is taking right now. So instead of going in and sitting for a multi-choice exam, he is taking 25 questions that are given quarterly over a 2-year period, and those can be done from home. He can do them on his phone or on his computer. And so this is a ongoing pilot project to see if this is an alternative way to do repeat certification. And I think that pilot wraps up maybe the end of this year. Professor Labor would know off the top of his head since he's doing it right now. And we'll talk again and more about this when we get to certification and recertification, but this was like, probably 2 years ago, this was the hottest debate going on because we got to the point where AAPA was about ready to call it quits and do their own thing. All right, so that is the end of my presentation about current topics, hot topics. Things are always changing and emerging, so throughout the year as things bubble up, I'll try to bring those to you. I will open up after topics class since I don't have time in between. So I want you to write just a really short page and a half paper on kind of your impression of, pick one or two of those hot topic issues and like, what are your thoughts about it today? Not research-based, like your own opinion. Like, man, I really feel strongly about our name, or I really feel strongly about our degree that we're offering, one way or the other. And then what I do is at the end of didactic year, I give those papers back to you and we see if your opinions change throughout the year. So this is just kind of like where I am today, at the stage I am now. What do I feel strongly about? Why do I feel strongly about it? And then we'll compare at the end of the year and see what happens. So I will open that up after topics class. And again, this is meant to be like, just sit down for 20 minutes and write it out. I don't want you to, this isn't like quoting sources or research or any of that. This is just kind of where I am right now in my thought process. All right, why don't we take a good 5 minutes and take a quick break, and then we'll come back and do topics.
Professor Garvey, can you post that slideshow you just had? I don't think I saw it, unless did other people see it on them?
Yep, I'll post that
just to kind of
along.
Stimulate the brain while we're writing.
Yep, I'll post that along with the assignment.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
So, Prof. Garvey, I saw that the international organizations, I saw Ghana in there. So that's very interesting. So we've had PAs in Ghana since the 60s.
Yeah.
Yeah, the reason being that there's a lot of rural areas, very, very deep rural areas that medical providers could never get there. And they live miles and miles away, and the only means of transportation back in the 60s was to walk. And it still exists in other countries like Tanzania. So majority of the African states decided to coin a term called medical officers. So the medical officers were trained by physicians, okay, and they didn't have an official title. They were just called medical officer. And so history being that they were trained by physicians. They were dispersed across the rural areas in the country, and they were able to go like midwives and stuff. So that's a whole team able to go to the rural areas and really provide healthcare. And so recently we were doing a mission work in Ghana, and we had the first time we've heard this physician assistant that was the first time. He said, okay, how come? And I said, oh, it used to be medical officers. I said, oh, so it was interesting. So what they adopted was that they tried to remove that physician oversight. So the physicians were training them. So what they've done is try to remove that physician oversight into PA oversight and PA schools, and coin the term physician assistant out of that medical. So they've like separated. So it was very interesting that a lot of countries have started adopting that to move away from that and have their own practice. So it was really interesting that I saw that in the international conference, some countries like, Zimbabwe and, but they've been around since the 60s. So the training was done by physicians, but now I think it's PAs that have started to do their own training. So that's why the name has come up. But it's been something that has been there for a really long time.
Yeah, and very parallel to the early PAs here that were trained by physicians.
Yeah. So I just wanted to give you that background. I heard about it. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah,
I
Michael,
appreciate
I have a question. When I was in Sierra Leone, they have chief health